Cloud services would basically be useless if there weren't ways for your application code to interact with them. For instance, think about a database service that you couldn't connect to, or a file storage service that wouldn't respond to requests. Code interacting with the cloud is a huge necessity, and Amazon takes it very seriously by supporting many different software development kits. Each SDK is essentially libraries of code, written by Amazon engineers, that make it very easy to interact with AWS services. They offer the SDKs in many different popular languages so that you can get started quickly with integrating AWS into your application. Amazon supports SDKs in most of the popular web programming languages. Unfortunately, there isn't a single portal listing all the SDKs in one place, but here are the SDKs that I was able to find that AWS supports: Android, iOS, JavaScript and Node.js, Java, Ruby, and Rails, PHP, Go, .NET, C++, and Unity. Hopefully your language of choice is listed here. Each project is open source and hosted on the AWS GitHub account. I personally appreciate this approach because it's easy to see the level of maintenance and support that each SDK is receiving. Take for instance the Go SDK. There have been 7 bug fix version releases in the past month. The issues are clearly labeled and are responded to in hours. Not to mention that there are almost 80 contributors as of this video, which shows that AWS accepts contributions from the community to make their code better. It's clear that the Go SDK has a lot of support and is maintained regularly. For any SDK you're thinking of using, just like most open source software, it's always best to check the status of the project to ensure you aren't heading towards a dead end. So what can you do with SDKs? Well, the SDKs are just library in whatever code you're using. An AWS SDK has code to allow you to interact with the services in AWS. Since nearly all services can be accessed through basic web requests, this code is wrapping this web request and making it more convenient to use. Just to repeat that, there's not really anything special necessarily that these SDKs are doing. You could do the same thing with your own code. The SDKs are just making it easier and more robust. The documentation for each SDK has a list of all the services that you can access and the operations you can perform. Some examples are reading or writing to a database, modifying CloudWatch rules, or invalidating a CloudFront distribution. Essentially, anything you can do through the console, you can do with an AWS SDK. Installing the SDK is going to depend on which language you're using. With the Node.js SDK, you simply use the Node Package Manager npm and install it with the command npm install AWS SDK. For Ruby, you would install the SDK as a Ruby gem with the command gem install AWS SDK. And for Java, you can use Maven to install it, but there's also an AWS toolkit for Eclipse that will not only get the SDK, but will also add Eclipse menu options to facilitate AWS development. Now let's look at a little demo of what the SDKs are capable of. Here's a small Node.js program that inserts an item into a DynamoDB database from a command line argument. Nothing special. Before we talk through the code, let's see it in action. At my terminal, I type the command to execute the program, and the third argument will be the string value I want to insert into the Dynamo table. It finishes silently and inserts the value into Dynamo. So let's jump to the web console now and look at the DynamoDB table I've created. Here are all the items in the table, and you can see the item that I just uploaded with my own program. Checking out the code that made that magic happen, you can see that the program is very short. All the heavy lifting is done by the AWS SDK. Let's look at the pieces of this program. At the top, the AWS SDK is imported into the program. Next, I need to set the region for AWS that I'll be working with. This is important so the SDK code knows how to build the URLs to access my resources in AWS. Then I create a new DynamoDB client by calling the DynamoDB constructor function from the SDK library. This newly created DynamoDB object is how I will call functions from the AWS SDK. Next, I create an item to insert into DynamoDB. This item has the data to insert, which is a timestamp, and the value from the command line, as well as the DynamoDB table name to insert it into. And finally, I call the put item function from my DynamoDB object, which puts the item I've created into my DynamoDB table in the cloud. Documentation for any code library is really important, and it's good that the AWS SDK is well documented. Here's the documentation for the Node SDK, which has all the services that you can interact with. Then the full API with examples for every operation available from the SDK. With the AWS SDK, you can do almost anything. And if you're working on an application to deploy to or interact with AWS, make sure you use the SDK.